I never expected leaving for deployment to feel heavier than the gear strapped to my back. The morning I left, the house was quiet in that familiar way that only a place you've lived in for years can be. I walked slowly through each room, not because I had forgotten anything, but because something inside me wanted to take one last look. The floorboards creaked under my boots the way they always had. The family photos on the wall caught the early light, frozen reminders of birthdays, barbecues, and ordinary days that once felt endless. In the garage, my grandfather's old tools still hung where I'd left them, smelling faintly of cedar and motor oil. I stepped onto the front porch with a mug of coffee and sat for a moment, looking out over the yard I'd spent years fixing up. That house wasn't fancy, but every nail and brick had a story behind it. As I locked the door and walked away, I felt something strange settle in my chest. Like the house already knew I wasn't coming back to the same life I had just left behind. If you lived in that neighborhood long enough, you eventually learned that nothing escaped Karen's attention. She was the president of the HOA, but she acted more like the self-appointed ruler of the entire street. Some people enforce rules because they believe in order. Karen enforced them because it made her feel powerful. My truck was apparently too aggressive looking for the community. My flagpole was an inch higher than recommended guidelines. Once she even complained that the shade of blue on my mailbox didn't match what she called the neighborhood aesthetic. At first, I treated it like background noise. Every community seems to have someone who needs a clipboard and a rulebook to feel important. Karen just happened to be ours. I nodded politely during meetings, fixed small things when they were reasonable, and ignored the rest. I figured as long as I handled my responsibilities, she would eventually find someone else to bother. Before I deployed, I made sure everything was officially documented. I filed my deployment paperwork with the HOA and the county, making it clear the house wasn't abandoned and that I would be returning. The morning I left, Karen stood across the street pretending to water her roses. She didn't wave or wish me luck. She just watched quietly with a small, satisfied smile that made the back of my neck tighten. Deployment has a way of rearranging your sense of normal. One day you're drinking coffee on your own porch. The next, you're standing under a sky so bright and dry it feels like the sun is pressing directly against your helmet. Out there, the heat settles into your bones. Engines roar, radios crackle, and sleep becomes something you grab in short pieces whenever the noise finally stops. Most of the time, your world shrinks down to the mission in front of you and the guys beside you. Everything back home fades into the background because it has to. That's the only way you stay focused. Signals were unreliable where we were stationed, so phones stayed quiet most days. When they finally caught a connection, the messages usually came in all at once. Photos from family, a quick text from an old friend, maybe a bank alert about some routine charge. Nothing unusual. At least that's what I expected the first time my phone started buzzing longer than normal. The first message came from my neighbor across the street. He sent a photo of my front door with a bright orange notice taped right across it. According to the HOA, my lawn had grown too high and my property was showing signs of neglect. I remember staring at the picture and shaking my head. I figured it was just Karen being Karen again. But the messages didn't stop. A week later, another neighbor sent a different photo. This notice was worse. It accused the property of being abandoned. Then my bank called about suspicious activity connected to my mortgage account. That was the moment something inside my chest tightened, because suddenly the problem back home didn't feel small anymore. A few days after the bank's first warning, the situation stopped feeling like a misunderstanding and started feeling like a slow-moving disaster. The next call I received was colder, more official. The representative explained that foreclosure proceedings were being reviewed because the HOA had reported my property as abandoned and carrying unpaid violations. Hearing those words while sitting in the middle of a dusty outpost halfway across the world felt surreal. I explained calmly at first that I was on active deployment and had filed the proper documentation before leaving. The person on the phone said they would make a note in the system, which is the kind of sentence that sounds helpful but rarely means anything is actually fixed. Days passed, and the notices kept stacking up in my inbox. Every message felt heavier than the last. Eventually, it became clear that waiting for someone else to correct the mistake wasn't going to work. I filed for emergency leave and spent weeks pushing paperwork through channels that move slower than anyone wants when time actually matters. When I finally landed back home, exhaustion hadn't even faded before I drove straight to my street. For a moment, I thought I had pulled into the wrong neighborhood. There was a car in my driveway that I had never seen before. Bright plastic toys were scattered across the yard. Curtains hung in the windows that definitely hadn't been there when I left. My chest tightened as I walked up the path. I knocked on the door, half expecting silence, half hoping someone would explain the confusion. The door opened, and a woman stood there holding a mug of coffee, looking at me with polite confusion. I told her quietly that this was my house. She blinked, hesitated, then said something that made the ground feel like it shifted under my feet. She explained they had bought the property at an HOA auction weeks earlier after it was declared abandoned. In that moment, the pieces finally fell into place. Karen hadn't just filed complaints while I was gone, she had sold my home. I left the house without arguing with the woman who opened the door. She wasn't the problem. She looked just as confused as I felt. And the last thing I wanted was to turn a bad situation into something worse for someone who had no idea what had really happened. Instead, I walked straight back to my truck and drove toward the HOA office with a quiet anger building behind my ribs. The office sat at the edge of the neighborhood park, the same bland building where Karen loved holding meetings about grass height and mailbox paint. When I pushed the door open, she was exactly where you would expect her to be, sitting behind the desk like nothing in the world had changed. Papers were spread neatly in front of her, and when she looked up, her expression wasn't shock. It was irritation. I told her plainly that my house had been sold. She leaned back in her chair and gave a small shrug, like the whole thing was just another routine formality. According to her, the property had been processed through HOA procedures after repeated violations and failure to respond to notices. In her mind, everything had been perfectly legal. Then she said something that made the room feel colder. She admitted she assumed I wouldn't come back from deployment and figured handling the property early would make things easier for everyone. For a few seconds, I just stood there looking at her, not shouting, not threatening, just letting the words settle in my head. Then I nodded once, turned around, and walked out. By the time I stepped back into the sunlight, the anger had hardened into something quieter, something focused. And I already knew exactly who I was going to call next. Anger can push people to do reckless things, but training teaches you something different. When everything around you is chaotic, the smartest move is to slow down and act with precision. Instead of yelling in the HOA office or threatening Karen the way she probably expected, I went home and started making calls. The first was to military legal services. Within an hour, I was speaking to someone who knew exactly which law applied to situations like mine. The Service Members Civil Relief Act exists for a reason, and what Karen had done didn't just cross a line, it shattered it. Once attorneys familiar with that law stepped in, things began moving very quickly. They reviewed the notices, the foreclosure paperwork, and the supposed HOA auction records. It didn't take long before the problems started surfacing. Violations had been exaggerated, signatures didn't match official documents, and the foreclosure itself had been pushed through without the court protections required for deployed service members. What Karen treated like routine paperwork suddenly looked a lot more like fraud. Subpoenas followed soon after. Investigators started requesting HOA financial records, meeting minutes, and communication logs. The calm confidence Karen had shown earlier began to crumble once the board realized they were under serious legal scrutiny. The family who unknowingly purchased the house was refunded through the courts and given time to relocate. Months of investigation eventually led to the decision that mattered most to me. The sale was ruled invalid and my property was legally returned. Karen, on the other hand, was left facing fines and restitution that grew larger with every document the investigators uncovered. Months later, the neighborhood felt different. The HOA that Karen once controlled so tightly collapsed under the weight of the investigation. One by one, the board members stepped down as the financial records revealed how badly things had been handled. The same legal pressure that forced my house back into my hands eventually caught up with Karen too. The fines, restitution, and legal costs piled up faster than she could manage, and before long, her own house went into foreclosure. When the property finally went up for sale, I bought it quietly. Not for revenge, but for something better. Today, that house serves as a small place where veterans transitioning back to civilian life can stay while they figure out their next chapter. Karen lives across town now in a small rented apartment. Every once in a while, our paths cross at the grocery store, and she quickly looks the other way. Some people think justice happens loudly. Sometimes it's quieter than that. Sometimes it just takes patience.